There was also, I think, a huge advantage, and I'm just going to be honest, it was a huge advantage to being a left-winger on this show. If you are like me, I think, and you see it as an advantage, and you use it as an advantage. There are some people who will see a 2v1, 3v1, and they'll be like, he's outnumbered. No. One, I get a lot more talking time. Not only do you get more speaking time, you can play them off each other, which was a core goal of mine, was to show the conflict between them. And it's also an advantage because people say it's a disadvantage. That optics of being outnumbered itself is an advantage. I almost always think it's an advantage. I'm also an advantage because I know this stuff more than both of them do. When dealing with someone like Tim Pool, there is no shortcut to just knowing the shit. Hey folks, please like, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to check out my newsletter. Information is in the description. One thing that I often look to is whether or not the comments are substantive in like the opposing person's comments. So when I see a lot of people commenting on the Carhartt, which, let's be honest, folks, everything is tactical. You got to get your edges where you can. It brings a smile to my face. I try to turn down the soy by 20%, turn down the intensity by like 30%, and mix in some positive reinforcement. There are certain people who have given me good advice, I think, in improving, and there's a lot of improvement left to do. Joanna, I think, my family members, Jola, some of the folks from Live and Learn, Hutch, Josiah, Econoboy, some other members of the community, to kind of be a little bit better in my delivery. I think it can still be improved a lot, and I'll talk a little bit about that. One thing that Joanna told me, which I think I want to take to heart, and it's something that I think I was doing more on the back end. I still had a little bit too much of that frenetic energy, kind of stumbling over myself a little bit. I'm a natural stutterer. It actually takes a little bit for me not to stutter. I'm kind of like Joe Biden in that regard. But there's just kind of still this kind of like frenetic thing right here, where if I can just take the space, is what Joanna said, take the space, and then breathe and then just dominate the space afterwards. So take it with that energy, but then let it breathe when you're actually in it. I think that was like a very useful piece of advice that might be difficult to actualize, but I think it will help with the presentation. Thank you so much, Josiah. Really appreciate it. I'm getting all kinds of messages from all kinds of people, and I really appreciate it. And I'm going to be honest, guys. I'm just going to be 100% real. And you know I keep it real. And you know my thoughts on Tim Pool generally, on the right generally. But behind the scenes, the Tim Pool people, the staff, and Tim himself were incredibly nice. I'm just going to tell you my experience. I'm not telling you that they're not still Trump deranged traitor people. I'm just going to tell you the honest truth, which is behind the scenes, everyone was delightful, including Joe. Joe and I like shared a car ride multiple times. We went on the train together, and yeah, super nice. I'm just telling you facts. We are going to substantively go through some of the things that we said. I'm not going to like rewatch it. I think there are a lot of reaction streams already, which also I like seeing people like react to this stuff. That's cool. I watch some of them, but I will like talk about some of the topics where I think good things happened, where I think we got bogged down, and what my thinking was at different moments. There were some moments there that were tactical moments for me, and I was itching for us to get into that, because I had that ready to go. How do you deal with people saying because constitutional law is up for interpretation then the Constitution doesn't mean shit? I think that kind of speaks for itself. And the point I was trying to drive home, I don't actually think I did that effective of a job of it, but it's that they don't actually believe that. Because you see Tim getting very animated about things like Hunter Biden's Second Amendment rights, about the law as relates to Jenna Ellis, right? And in his mind, as he explains it, it's not just his moral system. There's something about the law, due process, that kind of thing that has some value to him, separate and beyond his preferences, or that he has some preferences that incorporate constitutional legal notions. He said you didn't come prepared. No, I definitely came prepared, and we'll talk about that moment. It was so obnoxious they wouldn't admit to any of their obvious beliefs. Yeah. My inclination, by the way, guys, and I know that it gets obnoxious sometimes, and it's something that I need to figure out the right balance of it, was to push even more. There were many times where I was resistant. I was actually trying to pick my battles quite a bit. So there are times where I let things slide because I want to make a decision, like an active decision about what to talk about next. There was a little Greenland comment that he made at some point. There was a comment about the Hawaii slates of electors where I was just letting things go because I didn't want to get bogged down in certain repetitive conversations that we've already that you guys already know, right? And I want to have the conversation on my terms. Yeah, there was some baiting going on, but I was also trying to show that I'm willing to talk about what he's willing to talk about. So for example, the trans issues, when he asks a direct question about that, would it be cruel and unusual punishment? I want to be seen as willing to engage. I want them to be seen as not willing to engage. Some of these aren't like picking nits, though. Some of these reflect like really big substantive divergences. I think the best example of that is the question I already asked about, I don't really care about the Constitution. That to me is kind of giving the game away.
None of this is actually true. Neither faction really cares about any of the constitutions, the Bill of Rights, the laws. It is simply a moral worldview in battle with another moral worldview. I just think it's also silly. Literally nobody cares about anyone's constitutional rights.
And GoodLawgic from the beginning kind of abandoned this pretense that he's worried about the law. He was oscillating between the law and what he wishes the law were, and the origins of our country, the proper role of a national government. And then Tim kind of completely gives the game away and says, I don't really care about the Constitution. And then he says, I do care about the Constitution. And then he says, I just don't care about rights. And he says, I do care about the rights, but just the rights as I see them. And at the end of the day, I don't really care. Nothing matters. And then he goes to kind of like, well, the Democrats did this, and so I'm not going to feel bad about when Republicans do things. Or it's the Democrats' fault, and so we have to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. And I think that exposes fault lines between him and GoodLawgic, and also internal inconsistencies that would be unpleasant if further examined. When he said in the beginning he doesn't want to switch between the law and philosophy, yeah, that was one of those instances where I think he gave that up within a minute. And he was like, well, why do we have laws at all? Why do we have rights at all? And that seemed very, I kind of threw in a comment there. It's tongue in cheek when I say, you sound like a liberal justice. You're talking about the greater purpose of government. But there is some measure of truth there where he is taking on a kind of very high level purposivist analysis, which is in general, government is created to protect citizens. And so because government generally is created to protect citizens, I don't have to read in this textual distinction between citizens and persons that it's apparent in many amendments and articles of the Constitution. And that seems to be the opposite of textualism, a complete abandonment of the constitutional text. Okay, so let's deal with some of the substance here. Starting off, I wanted the conversation to be about Khalil, and I wanted the conversation to be about rights. And I wanted it to be grounded in the law. My goal was to have acknowledgments from both individuals that there are at least some First Amendment rights for green card holders. And that is true. Both of them seem to accept some framework where green card holders, at a bare minimum, have some First Amendment rights. Both of them appeared to accept that premise. That's helpful. It is incredibly unhelpful, in my mind, for GoodLawgic to constantly, I think, be throwing out red herrings. So, for example, he asked me, because he's not an immigration lawyer, he asked me what the standard was for distinguishing certain admissions decisions from well-established constitutional principles. So, for example, the fact that we don't apply the same First Amendment analysis to people who are asking to come into the country. If you're trying to get into the country and you're like a person of bad moral character, the precedent of this country is that you're allowed to be rejected. And there's also precedent that says, for example, foreign corporations have no First Amendment rights. So how do you make sense of that when it appears that you're arguing that Congress can't at all make these kinds of viewpoint-based discriminations? And it's not an entirely, I'm going to tell you, there's some problems with the posture that I've presented, which is exclusion versus deportation or I should say First Amendment restrictive conduct from within the country. There's some problems conceptually with it. The first is justifying it, right? What justifies that the bright line is exclusion versus non-exclusion? Now, I don't have to justify it because I'm just describing, in my opinion, what the best reading of the case law is. So in my view, I don't have to justify it if we're talking about law, okay? There are other conceptual hiccups with it because it's also not only that. It's mostly that for the gross kind of like differences, and we'll talk a little bit about the Chinese exclusion laws, but it's beyond that too. There are other instances of First Amendment jurisprudence where it can't solely be explained by a exclusion exceptional rationale. But I do believe it is the dominant one to explain the major differences. So I had provided to good logic, this language from Kleindienst versus Mendel, which is facially legitimate and bona fide. And that's rationale that pertains, that the court kind of references in Trump versus Hawaii when they're talking about the Muslim ban case. And the court there says, we have this precedent from Mendel that says on these admission decisions, we only need to look into whether the government's rationale is facially legitimate and bona fide. But they're like, okay, but we'll run the analysis as though it were rational basis. Okay? Rational basis review, for those of you who recall, on the tiers of scrutiny is the lowest tier of scrutiny. And so the implication from Justice Roberts in Trump versus Hawaii is facially legitimate and bona fide is an even lower standard than rational basis. And of course, rational basis review, you're allowed to have pretextual rationale, right? And so facially legitimate and bona fide, wow, that is like super low standard. And in Trump versus Hawaii, they're like, we're being nice by applying rational basis. But it kind of doesn't really make much conceptual sense what the court's doing in Trump versus Hawaii. And that's why the opinion is bad, at least with respect to the Establishment Clause. Because the court seems to suggest, well, an exclusion decision is subject to this very, very low standard. I'll remind all of you, the point I was making in that conversation about the Chinese exclusion laws aren't that the Chinese exclusion statutes are still in force. It's that the holdings from Che Chen-ping, Fan Wei-ting, the other Chinese exclusion cases, that the holdings of those cases are still good law. They have not been attacked or upset by changes in our constitutional analysis, by and large, the core holdings there. So the court in Trump versus Hawaii, when they say Trump in argument agrees that a Muslim ban would be unconstitutional, I think they're playing a little bit of a game there. Because why? The reason why Trump doesn't want to say it's a Muslim ban is because, maybe it's because of the legal problems there, but I think it's a little deeper than that. I think it has to do with the fact that politically it would seem untenable to run on an explicit Muslim ban and to be arguing in court that even if it were an explicit Muslim ban, it would be constitutional under the Chinese exclusion law precedent. But if you look at the reasoning of the court in Trump versus Hawaii, they do say that even if it were the case, right, for any admission decision, we would apply the facially legitimate and bona fide standard from Kleindienst versus Mendel. And that standard basically says we look at the face of the rationale. We don't inquire at all into the motives. It's not 100% clear how that differs from rational basis, I'm going to be honest with you. And we're incredibly deferential to the executive branch or to Congress. But if that's the case, then the Chinese exclusion laws, if Congress passed right now that said Chinese people aren't let into the country, then you're going to apply facially legitimate and bona fide rationale. And that is the Chinese exclusion law. And the evidence of that is that the Chinese exclusion law, case law, has not been overturned. There are people who sow doubts about it, but nothing explicit that those cases are overturned. So me reading those cases, I say, okay, well, if you can ban black people from coming to this country, if you can ban Chinese people from coming to this country, if you can ban Asian people from coming to this country, I'm assuming that it would be constitutional for you to ban Jews from coming into the country. Because if all the standard we're applying is facially legitimate and bona fide reasoning, then yeah, of course you can ban Jews and you can ban people who say anything you want. You can ban people who are Democrats. You can just make a law that says if you want to be admitted into this country, you need to be a Republican. That's me reading the case law. Now, there's an additional realist lens that you can put on yourself when you're examining this and say, wait a minute, Pisco, there's no way a court would sign off on that. But we are left with the words of the court, and we have to make sense of their precedent. And the precedent is, hey, if this test, facially legitimate and bona fide, is even lower than rational basis, which is what Roberts suggests, what kind of test is it? Okay, so the court can present, the government can present some evidence of compliance, or I should say, of a rationale that says, hey, well, we're banning people who are pro-Republicans because we released a report that says Republicans are more likely to do terrorist actions. And it's facially legitimate, right? So we can't even inquire into the report. We can't even look into actual facts because it's facially legitimate, right? That framework, if it applies at all, which I think it does based on what the court has said in Trump versus Hawaii, if that framework applies, the court was clear. It was for admissions decisions, not just for anything related to immigration. The unjustifiable step that GoodLawgic is making when he repeats that language is suggesting that very deferential test for admissions decisions applies throughout the country on everything related to immigration. And that's what I say when you say that a person has First Amendment rights as a green card holder, but they're subject to that deferential standard that is existing at the time of admission, even once they've been admitted. What kind of right is that, right? It's so ephemeral. If it's so easy, right? Like if it's so easy to get rid of that First Amendment right by just waving it away when you sign the green card form, which, by the way, there's no form, part of the form that says that you waive away your First Amendment rights while you're in the country, right? If you can just wave it away like that, or if the government really doesn't have to put any showing and they only have to apply this facially legitimate and bona fide test while you're in the country, what kind of First Amendment right is that, right? At a certain point, he was arguing that you couldn't deport someone under the First Amendment for ordering French bread, but you could deport someone in the country for support for Palestine or support for Hamas. Well, the question is, what kind of First Amendment right is that? That's a First Amendment right that turns on whether or not the government has some prior about the worth or lack of worth in your speech. That is exactly the kind of decision making that we don't trust the government to make when it comes to the First Amendment, right? The whole point of the First Amendment is to get the government out of the role of testing whether certain speech is better than other speech. Only in the most dire of circumstances do we want the government to be endowed with the authority to do that kind of judgment calls on speech. So when you have GoodLawgic in the middle of the debate saying, yeah, it would be obviously against the First Amendment for the government to support a deportation rationale on the basis of your breakfast order, but it wouldn't protect core speech, right? The First Amendment, when it applies at all, is at its maximum with political speech. And so it would seem absurd to suppose that, okay, the First Amendment protects your breakfast order, but not your core political speech. And there was no way for him to really contest that, and he didn't contest it in any real way, other than to give the bare assertion that the admission decision framework, which is highly deferential, which I've acknowledged is deferential enough to include Chinese bans, right? And this is what was so odd, right? GoodLawgic was seemingly playing the optic game on both sides. I was willing to bite the bullet and say, yeah, based on the court's precedent, seems like you can even ban Chinese people based on their ancestry because it's so deferential. But he was fighting me on that. He was arguing that it's incredibly deferential, it applies everywhere, but it's not deferential enough at the admission stage to include the Chinese exclusion laws. He was unwilling to bite the bullet of deference in any situation involving racial-based exclusions or restrictions or religion-based exclusions or restrictions. And that is the telltale sign of I don't want to say bad faith, but a shaky heart. If you're really going to your guns, and Tim Pool kind of bit the bullet in a bad way, I think ultimately, that, yeah, I guess I wouldn't say anything and he flip-flopped a little bit on that too. If you really follow what people are saying, you can realize why I crushed that debate. Listen, I could do improvements, but it was a bloodbath, in my opinion, complete bloodbath. Some of these admissions were shocking. It's especially true if you follow what people are saying and you're not as worried about optics. I think the optics stuff matters 100%, but it's a goddamn bloodbath if you look at what they're actually saying. And him flip-flopping and saying, yeah, I wouldn't condemn a deportation order based solely on someone's religion within the country. But the fact that you're kind of trying to avoid that framing, even when you're the one arguing the maximal version of deference, where I seem to be, I think, in my opinion, from a neutral observer, trying to genuinely wrestle with the precedent we have and make sense of it and say, hey, yeah, I mean, it sucks. I may not agree with it, but you can, at the port, at a port of entry, you can ban someone pretty much or restrict someone for a shit ton of reasons based on the court's precedent, unless it conflicts with like one of the laws of Congress, right? Any limitation that Congress imposes is going to be a self-limitation. Now, there could be issues with Congress's statutes that like there might be a reason why certain exclusion decisions are not allowed because it violates one of Congress's own rules that they've set for the government itself. So I'm not saying that every exclusion decision is by necessity going to be lawful. And I hope that makes sense. Just because I say that they have great deference when it comes to exclusion decisions doesn't mean, as applied in the real world, that every admission decision is lawful if Congress itself is putting limitations on the government. Let's talk also, so that's kind of an overview of some of the problems with the immigration argument that they were offering and that GoodLawgic provided. There was this other thing. So at the start, I phrased it like in a way that was optically bad when he said, well, it's a conditional green card. And I said, well, just assume it's not. I understand why that looked like I was conceding that he wasn't an LPR. And in retrospect, that was a mistake. I should have been like, hold on, Tim. That's a conditional visa. It doesn't mean what you say. It doesn't mean he's not a lawful permanent resident. It means in 2 years he needs to, as opposed to in 10 years, he needs to check in one more time. But it's every green card expires. That doesn't mean you're not still an LPR. But if you're on a conditional green card, it just means you got to check in in 2 years to make sure it's not a sham marriage. That's all it means. But I understand when I went immediately to the hypothetical, it looked like I was unsure about that. Now, I cleaned it up a little bit by saying, hey, he's still an LPR, all that stuff. But I understand optically how, in the moment, it sounds like I don't know that he's a conditional green card holder, when I absolutely, obviously do. But my instinct is always to jump to the hypothetical to get to get to the interesting conversation. But that can actually hurt you sometimes. And I actually saw Tomato said it in the Discord that she thought I did too many hypotheticals. I think it's true. I think I should have been more calibrated with my use of hypotheticals, just because I like them because they get to the heart of issues. Doesn't mean I'm not going to still use them. Oh, you didn't think I did? Oh, I thought you said I did. My bad. I think that, though, the use of hypotheticals, I could have been more calibrated. I don't think that I should not have done it, but I think that it could have been more. Yeah, I think they were annoyed by me using them. Yeah, that is true. But I guess self-critique then. I think I could have been a little bit more calibrated and not jump to them so quickly when I know the facts, right? So that first one, right, where it's the conditional green card, it sounds like I don't know what a conditional green card is. It looks, obviously I clean it up at like 2 minutes later, but I don't need to jump into the hypothetical right away. I can just stop and be like, wait a second, this is what a conditional green card is, and let's actually get the facts right. So that was one where could have been more clarity. Let me take a step back from the issues real quick and talk about some of the global tactics. I already told you that I was trying to lower my soy levels by 20%, lower the intensity by 30%. And the reference here is to the actual justice warrior debate and generally be a little bit more likable. There was also, I think, a huge advantage, and I'm just going to be honest. It was a huge advantage to being the left winger on this show. Complete huge advantage. If you are like me, I think, and you see it as an advantage and you use it as an advantage. There are some people who will see a 2v1, 3v1, and they'll be like, he's outnumbered. He's outnumbered. No. Helps with a lot of things. Now, if you get bullied, if you let yourself get bullied, yes, it'll be a huge disadvantage. If you're not as experienced, it'll be a huge disadvantage. But this is why I think it's incredibly helpful for someone like me. And 2, 3 people, that's a sweet spot. 1, I get a lot more talking time. I do. GoodLawgic for 50% of that debate, or if not more, is a non-factor. That's part of Tim's style. That's part of what he wants to do. Maybe his hubris. It's how he runs things. But that just is a fact. And it lets and prevents people from doing a rhythm and from building a rhythm, especially if they're not building off each other in 100% the same way. Not only do you get more speaking time, you can play them off each other, which was a core goal of mine, was to show the conflict between them. Playing people off each other is very effective. When I took a moment to look at GoodLawgic and I said, that was crazy, right? Now I have both of the lawyers on the panel taking a kind of skeptical look at what Tim just said. And Tim is just sitting there at his own partner, be uncomfortable with defending him. Joe, I like you.
Oh, I'm so glad.
I like you. What Tim just said was crazy. Well, I need you to acknowledge that.
What's crazy?
I don't know what he said.
What Tim just said is that legally, the Secretary of State or any member of the administration, I'll even assume the law says what it says and it applies to green cards. For any reason, they can deport any alien. And so now I'm in a position where I'm making GoodLawgic uncomfortable because now he has to choose, like, do I commit myself to a position that I can't really defend? Do I kind of defend it lukewarmly? Or do I risk offending the host? I think if GoodLawgic was smarter, he'd be like, no, that's crazy, Tim. Come on. But he doesn't want to do that. GoodLawgic, in the nature of the debate, he doesn't lose anything by just saying, I don't go that far at all, Tim. I don't say the Constitution doesn't matter. I just think the Constitution matters in the way I think the Constitution works and how I view the Constitution. But when you say the Constitution doesn't matter, I can't agree with that. If he says that emphatically, now he gains the edge, but he risks putting Tim and making Tim look dumb. And now Tim is being double teamed by his guests. So that's, if he goes and protects himself, now he's undermined Tim. And he's undermined Tim. Tim is more apt to lash out. He might be worrying about being invited back. So who knows what is running through his head. If he completely accepts Tim's argument, hey, the Constitution doesn't matter, well, now he's kind of appeased Tim, but he's committed himself to an indefensible position, or one that at least that he doesn't hold. And if he kind of gives a middling, lukewarm response, he looks a little Weasley himself, and the optics of us kind of hashing out how crazy Tim is in the moment, it's just structurally not an advantageous place for Tim to be. And so that's an inherent advantage in me having 2 or 3 people, to play with in front of me. I'm always going to do that. I'm going to be like, wait, you don't agree with that, right? Come on. And I did it the other way around as well. And there was one moment where I think one of the better moments is when Tim Pool very kind of like casually says, because he always wants to stress that he's against the death penalty. And he says, I think you should exile these people. You shouldn't use the death penalty. But I'm fine with exile of U.S. citizens, even child and murderers. I'm just like,
I don't like that person. I think what they did is evil beyond belief. And if we were to
Let's unleash them on the world.
let's throw them to other countries.
Yeah. Well, to other countries, my point is...
Wait, do you want to release like into Cuba? And I see in that moment, GoodLogic's like, oh, you just want to unleash them to the world? And I'm like, perfect. I'm going to act like I'm in concert with GoodLawgic, and I'm going to say, wait, you want to send people, child to Cuba? And I didn't move off of that, right? Because I saw that was a moment where GoodLawgic even was like, what? And when I notice that a conservative is, when I get signals from GoodLawgic about what he finds like, that was a mistake from GoodLawgic, because when he said that, I'm like, okay, that's an area of where conservatives feel something weird about something there. I'm going to push on it. And I'm not going to, and there were times when he was trying to transition away, and I kept bringing him back and saying, but hang on, you don't want to exile American, child to other countries, right? You want to do it for Antarctica? You want to send them to Antarctica? There are scientists on Antarctica, someone said. You're gonna let the scientists get attacked, but even then, right? And now we're starting to pick apart at the seams some of the rationales, because the whole rationale of this is why you exile instead of keeping them in prison is because we don't want to make the taxpayer pay for it. Well, if the taxpayer isn't paying for it, aren't you kind of sentencing them to death by starvation and exposure to the elements to the extent that you're housing them someplace else? And if you're just letting them free someplace where they could live, then they could come back one day. One of their family members can go pick them up. And so you're either in favor of the death penalty by starvation. And he said maybe, right? He said maybe. I don't want to throw them in. I don't want to exile them and make them so they're free. Put them in a. But then that's like the death penalty. Do they not have any food there? Or
Nope.
do they have servants there? I guess
None.
So you're killing them by banishing them to a place where there's no.
Maybe.
Okay, you're in favor of the death penalty. You're just favor of death penalty by starvation and exposure.
Maybe.
No, you're not. You're not.
No. I'm saying maybe they'll die. Yeah, maybe.
And then he tried to change maybe to mean, oh, maybe they'll die. But when the question obviously was, would you support the death penalty by starvation and exposure? And so it's just a very unfortunate position. If you are not completely confident on a position, you just kind of take it at a whim. Thank you so much. So basically, a big part of the debate strategy is to see where they diverge and then play them. Yeah, 100% it was. I'm just going to be honest. And I think it worked. The other one example of that is insurrection. Tim's over there saying, I can't, now we'll get into the specifics of the insurrection stuff. So I can't comment if it's an insurrection. I'm just using the Jan 6 standard. And then when Tim lays out a standard and it's so ingrained in GoodLawgic, right, for him to say Chaz is an insurrection. Tim doesn't want to say that except to apply the Jan 6 standard. But GoodLawgic is chomping at the bit to say that Chaz is an insurrection. And so the fact that he's chomping at the bit to say that Chaz is an insurrection, I'm going to say, that's clear. Wait, there was an autonomous zone, right? GoodLawgic? And GoodLawgic, yeah. I'm like, how's that not an insurrection? And he's like, it absolutely was. And then he gets ahead of steam, and he gets a little bit too animated. And then he says, yeah, if you try to seize a police station, that's an insurrection. In the moment where I wasn't making as much progress with Tim Pool because he was off in crazy land, I can come in and say, seize a police station, right? That's an insurrection. But what about seizing the Capitol?
To me, that is,
how is that not an insurrection?
that's utterly an insurrection.
Okay.
If you take over a police station, that's an insurrection. If you
take over the police station as an insurrection, what about the Capitol?
They weren't trying to seize the Capitol.
Tim can't defend him because Tim just is off on Never Never Land. All eyes are on GoodLawgic, and I've used GoodLawgic's frustration and his tells vis-a-vis Chaz and the other Black Lives Matter protests to understand that dynamic and to move my target now to him and to put him in the hotspot. Did you find? Yeah. So Tomato, if you go to my edited video, or if you go to my Twitter, one of my first tweets is going to be all of the times he said it. He also tweeted about it too. It's somewhere else. I have a tweet, but if you guys want that, I'll produce it as well. So that's the kind of playoff strategy, which I think is just an inherent strategy. If you're outnumbered, don't say that it's just like, don't consider that just a disadvantage. And it's also an advantage because people say it's a disadvantage. People will say, oh, he's outnumbered. And so that optics of being outnumbered itself is an advantage. I almost always think it's an advantage. And the more talking time is just, it's such a benefit when you think about stepping outside the actual framework of the debate in terms of getting your name out there, because you're talking most of the time. So it really is a humongous advantage. I can't overstate it. I was at a huge advantage in that entire conversation. I'm also at an advantage because I know the stuff more than both of them do. Another tactic that, I say tactic, but when dealing with someone like Tim Pool, there is no shortcut to just knowing the shit and being like well-informed on random things. You can like watch their stream recently to see what they're talking about. But if I didn't know what I knew about May 28th, May 29th, you'd be in a bit of a pickle, right? If I didn't have basic knowledge of the Jenna Ellis indictment and conviction, there's not like, he can kind of walk over you, right? He has this kind of very esoteric knowledge. If I haven't had a lot of these conversations before, and I kind of know the way they go, I can be in trouble, right? I could trip myself up in the trans situation when he says, would it be cruel and unusual for trans people to be thrown in with born female prisoners? And that can trip someone up. Don't commit yourself to positions. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Don't be afraid to say, it's a hard question. I don't know. I don't really have the facts in front of me. Know your stuff, because you need to be able to defend yourself in order to go on offense. And if you're constantly on defense and not able to parry and deflect what they're saying with actual facts and knowledge, you can be quickly inundated. And the impression is you don't know what you're talking about. As to the issue of these kinds of crazy standards, we already talked about the crazy standard a little bit of, I just don't care about the Constitution. Well, I mentioned it, but I didn't really talk about it that much. But let's first do the mens rea stuff. When someone says, oh, you want to read his mind? I think that there's kind of like two tactics you can take. One is the kind of tactic I took, which is, this is normal. We do it all the time in criminal matters. It's called mens rea. You have to infer it from circumstantial evidence. And so it's not unusual at all to do this kind of thing. You can take that approach of saying this is kind of like banal. We infer mental states all the time. The other way to do it is to use an example from their own catalog, but you have to know an example from their catalog. So one way I could do it is, wait a second. Do you think that Joe Biden, when he did the Burisma thing, that he was intending to help his own family when he did the deal with the Ukrainian president for the firing of the prosecutor? And they say, yes. Wait, are you a mind reader? And so then you just bring it there. The problem is that's a kind of like a derailer. And so you get stuck into one of these other conversations. Sometimes it helps because that's where you want to go if you want to change topics. But in that moment, I kind of wanted to stay where I was. But you could do that, right? You could say, you think this conspiracy that everyone knows, that, and I appreciate the super chats, everyone knows about is that it was motivated by bad malicious thoughts, and they say yes. And then you apply their standard of mens rea, which is you can never read someone's mind, which of course is ridiculous. And then you get a concession that, yeah, well, of course you can infer mental states based on circumstantial evidence. Okay, let's go back to substance for a bit. More substance talk. The issue of he's a green card holder and We already talked about how absurd it would be that the First Amendment would protect his right to order certain food, but not his right for political advocacy. There is no citation that GoodLawgic provides that legitimate and bona fide standard applies in the interior of the country for resident aliens. And you really have to think about how vacuous any First Amendment right would be for resident aliens if it indeed is the case that such individuals can be deported for literally anything they say. If they can be deported for literally anything they say, in what sense do they have the First Amendment protections at all? It's not helpful also to say that deportation is not a punishment. When you say deportation is not a punishment, it is true, because punishment has it's a term of art in the Constitution that refers to criminal punishment. And so by definition, it's not a punishment because it's not a criminal action. So don't get confused when GoodLawgic says it's not a punishment. Just because it's not a punishment, though, doesn't mean that the First Amendment doesn't apply. The First Amendment undoubtedly applies to things that are not punishments. And these were moments where I think they looked very weak. When there were clear answers, they were unwilling to bite the bullet. So when I said, so you're admitting, right, that what you just said was wrong, that the First Amendment applies beyond punishments, right, GoodLawgic? And instead of just saying yes or no, and saying, yes, of course, and moving on, he looks weaselly. Okay, next up in terms of substance from the debate, the stuff about the insurrection. So let's talk about that. I knew that Tim Pool had called it an insurrection. And I thought that it's possible that he'll bring up May 28th, 29th situation. I'll talk about one missed opportunity that I had there, which I think would have been incredible. I think it's implicit, but it's not explicit. So here's the implicit point. You cared so much about May 28th, 29th, whatever, White House stuff, and you haven't even read the only government report that came out about it. You haven't even read it. Didn't even know it existed. Same thing, by the way, with Rob. Rob didn't know it existed. I looked it up. I found it, right? So these people don't care to even read the official accounting for these cases that are so important to them. Now, the way that was implicit was when I kept asking, did you read the Parks Department report? Did you read the report? Did you read the report? So, but I wish I'd brought that home with saying, like, Tim Pool says he cares about this. He says there should have been commissions on it. Hasn't even done the work to read the less than 30-page report, or I think it was something like that, from the Parks Department on it. Didn't even know it existed. And then, so then that's one aspect to it. That's one thing where I wish I'd made it more explicit. I kind of let him move me around in different places to seem reasonable. So when he asked me like questions that weren't completely on point, my goal was to take the question and then bring it back. Take the question, then bring it back. Sometimes we didn't bring it back because I found other areas of interest for me. But I didn't want to be like, hey, there were some times where I said, answer my question first. I think there were 1 or 2 times. But in general, I was willing to go with the flow. But here was an example where if he had brought up the May 28th, 29th thing, I wanted to bring up Insurrection Jan 6 because I knew he had called it an insurrection. Before I did that, there's the tension with Donald Trump too, because I know he's probably loath to publicly criticize Donald Trump. And so it's not just me playing off Tim Pool with GoodLawgic. I also want to play Tim Pool off of Donald Trump. That's why I'm constantly phrasing it in terms of, would you condemn Trump if he did this? If he did this, would you condemn him? Would you criticize Trump if he did da-da-da? Even my phrasing of that is putting him in conflict with Trump and making him look like a Trump dick sucker, which is what he looked like that whole debate. So it's very intentional in the sense that I want to put him in contradiction, in dispute, in an uncomfortable position vis-a-vis Trump. I don't want to just untailor it to any person. And so when he says, there should have been commissions on it, May 28th, 29th, why didn't it happen? Why wasn't there investigations? What do? I say, number one, Trump didn't say it was a big deal. He said it was no big deal. Did he lie? So now Tim has to spend a moment to be like, no, he didn't lie. I can't call him a liar. Oh, so he was wrong about whether his life was in danger, so he's deluded. And Tim says, yes, Trump is deluded about his safety. So he has to come up with a story. He's like Johnny Bravo. He's like so brave and his ego is so big that he can ignore clear and present dangers to his own health and security.
Why did Trump say it was no big deal then?
What, May 29th?
Yeah, why did he say no big deal?
He's got an ego problem.
Okay, so he lied. Did Trump lie, yes or no?
No.
Well, you just said it was a big deal.
You're asking me if Trump's opinion is a correct statement?
Was it correct? Is he lying about his actual opinion? Does Trump think it was a big deal?
I think Trump thinks it's not a big deal.
Okay, so
Like I said,
is
Republicans
Trump,
don't enforce
is,
against
is
this
Trump wrong about whether it was a big deal or not?
100%.
Okay, so was his life in danger?
Absolutely, it was.
Okay,
That's why they brought him into a bunker.
So he's deluded for thinking that it wasn't a danger.
Absolutely, the dude has got an ego problem.
That's one area where I'm already putting off. Great, you call Trump delusional? That's my job done. The next one is, why wasn't there a commission or report? Well, who was in charge of the government, dude? You had Republicans by that time in the Senate, and they had time to make a Hunter Biden commission in the Senate pre-election. Why didn't they open up hearings for May 28th, 29th? And then Trump himself. You're mad there weren't more arrests, that there wasn't a special counsel? Why didn't Trump do something about it? And so he says, yeah, it's Trump's fault. Great. Concession, moved on. Now we're on to insurrection. So I said, you called them, watch what it did. I brought up the fact that he called it an insurrection. He brought up May 28th, 29th, but I call it the fact that he's called these things insurrections. Because I know that he did. And so now I am hoping to press him to get him to call Jan 6 an insurrection or to look absurd in denying it. So this entire time, right, something that he's brought up, right? He's brought up May 28th, 29th to show the lack of consistency of Democrats in the left. And I have judo made it into Tim Pool's consistency, framing Trump as the bad guy. Trump is the reason we don't have commissions. Trump's deluded. You're inconsistent. That doesn't happen unless you know about May 28th, 29th, unless you know what Trump's statements about it are, unless you know who's in control of the Senate in 2020, unless you know that you have the receipts of him saying it. And so, yeah, I think that's a great moment. We have the clips, and we inserted it into our edit of the video because it's true. He's inconsistent. He had a pre-Jan 6 standard for insurrection that he applied to Chaz, that he applied to the courthouse situation. He called them insurrections. He called the people in there insurrectionists. Why doesn't he call Jan 6 an insurrection if he was willing to call it of the Black Lives Matter situations? There is no answer for that. No one has even tried, not a single person has even tried to show that there's some logical through line in Tim Pool's thinking about why pre-January 6th he called those events insurrections, but not January 6th. No answer, not even an attempt.
You, Dan Bongino, other commentators on the right, I have clips of them all called the George Floyd situations insurrections. You did before Jan 6. So using your
No, we didn't.
Yes, I have the clips.
You're wrong. Completely wrong.
Not only
before January 6th.
Before January 6th. Not only
Okay.
did you do that, you have tweets about it.
You're saying that before January 6th happened, I referred to the George Floyd riots as an insurrection.
Yes, you did.
And I got to tell you, man, the government of Portland has now joined insurrection against the federal government.
He tried to pull the following. He tried to say, oh, well, I was using the term in different ways. He started blurting out some bullshit about the Insurrection Act he had no clue about. I could have spent time trying to grill him on that. Didn't do it because I didn't want to waste time. But there's no answer. Because usually they say, oh, I'm not calling it an insurrection in isolation. I'm calling it an insurrection under the Jan 6 standard. You called it an insurrection before Jan 6. Pure L, complete total L, no accounting for it on a major issue. That is, you're playing cover for terrorist insurrectionists who tried to steal our country. Just molding in the live chat of his because they know his position is untenable and he's getting wrecked. During this point in the debate, GoodLawgic is pretty much a non-factor, which is all well and good for me. I'm not losing sleep about it. I like Joe. I like debating with Joe. I thought the moments in there when we were going back and forth were great. They brought up the first safe country rule for asylum seekers. I could have gotten into that if I wanted to, because there are responses there as well. But I was ready for that, right? Like, if they wanted to push hard in that area, I would have been prepared for that, which is nice. It's nice having the confidence that I had in the discussion to, while I'm in the discussion, make active decisions about what to do, to be mindful about what I'm saying and what I want to say and where I want to go. If you're scrambling, you can't make those strategic decisions about where you want to go, where you don't want to go in the moment. I didn't bring up Tenet. I didn't feel it was relevant. And also, realize, guys, you're playing into their hands if you just do the most obvious thing. And then you give them 2 minutes to soapbox and you derail what I was there to do, which was to fight for what I believe is right, not to embarrass Tim on that thing, but to embarrass Tim and GoodLawgic on the thing I want to talk about. And so if I bring up Tenet Media, one, I don't have evidence that shows his knowingness. There's circumstantial stuff, but he's going to challenge me on that, and I'm going to be able to say, well, I just think you did it. And then I look like an idiot. And he gets a soapbox, and then he gets pissed off, and then he's on the offensive, and now he's more, he's going to be more aggressive and less passive. And I want him passive. So it's a tactical, I think, strategic mistake to bring up Tenet sua sponte. It's too obvious, So I was never planning on doing that. People were saying, bring up Tenet, say that he's for Russia. I mean, it's so obvious, it's too on the nose.